The following program contains material that is not suitable for some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome to Mountain Wellness, a show where we have raw, open conversations about mental illness and find people making a difference. I'm your host, Christine Napier. Anger, fear, grief, and anxiety are common emotions in our world today. Often these feelings become entangled as we deal with life's most extreme challenges. On today's episode, we take an in-depth look at the journey of grief. In 2007, a long-distance road trip changed the lives of Julie Cluff and her family forever. Here's Julie's story.
On Mother's Day in 2007, I was driving across the country with my three youngest children. My son James was 12, my daughter Carrie was 10, and my son David was 8. And we were heading towards from Texas to North Carolina, and we'd left early in the morning. It was Mother's Day, and we were traveling across the country. And when we got about halfway, about mid-afternoon, and the trip had been going really well. You know, when you're traveling with kids, sometimes it doesn't go so well. The trip had been going really well, but my daughter and son in the back seat, my daughter Carrie said, David's bugging me. So she slides over to the seat behind me, and I looked back and I watched her slide from the middle seat to the back seat. And as she moved, she said, Happy Mother's Day, Mom, I love you, and snapped in her seatbelt. And then the car got quiet, and apparently I fell asleep at the wheel, and I have no recollection of even being tired, but I woke up and I was bouncing along in the median between the eastbound and the westbound highway. And when I panic-stricken tried to pull the SUV back up on the highway, it just started to roll. Like I could just feel the wheels come up off of the grass, and it just rolled and rolled and rolled, and I don't even know how many times we rolled. And we landed, and I had no eyesight. I couldn't see anything. Everything was dark, and I could hear my son James next to me crying, and so I knew he was alive, but I didn't know how injured he was. And as my eyesight came back, I was calling for Carrie and David with no response. And when my eyesight came back, I saw that we were sitting facing the highway upright, and I turned back for Carrie and David, and they weren't there. And I just kept calling for them, and I started to notice off to my left that people were gathering in the grass on the side of the highway. And that's when I realized that Carrie and David had been thrown from the car. And unfortunately, they didn't make it. They died that day. The 3 years after the accident, I was dealing with so much guilt and so much shame over what had happened, and so much torment. It was horrendous. There were times when it just got so dark and so heavy and so hard. But I was very, in the ways that I could be, I was proactive in looking for answers. I was always reading. I sought out medical help because I had pretty severe PTSD after the accident. It was hard to be in a car. It was 6 months before I drove a car regularly after the accident. When something really hard happens, it's almost like an earthquake. We're at the epicenter of the earthquake, where all the destruction happens, where all the really hard stuff happens. And our family and friends, depending on how close they are to us, they're further outside of that. And while they feel the effects of it, they don't feel the effects to the extent that we do, that are sitting right in the middle of the rubble. And so as we try to rebuild from that place of brokenness, our family and friends, they don't feel that effect the same way that we do. So they get tired over time of hearing the effects of what we're still experiencing. And so they can really, because they're so far outside of it, they don't really understand the volume of the difficulty that we're dealing with.
When we come back, Julie shares how she processed the grief after her devastating loss. Mountain Wellness will continue.
What is it about this place? What is it that has led to such a vibrant community of thinkers and doers? What is it that inspires a few young doctors to imagine the world's first artificial heart, or a few computer pioneers to create one of the 4 original nodes of the internet, or lifts an unlikely researcher to imagine a Nobel-worthy genetic code, and a young entrepreneur to imagine Adobe, and another Pixar Studios? This remarkable place has always fueled the life-saving and the life-affirming. This is the story of University of Utah health plans. Imagine the very best care science has to offer, and world-class researchers collaborating to make it that much better, proving that healthcare and health insurance can be more accessible, more affordable, and more responsive. Now imagine what an entire health system and globally recognized university can do for you.
The following program contains material that is not suitable for some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to Mountain Wellness. Before the break, Julie Cluff shared the traumatic events surrounding the deaths of her 2 youngest children. Now, Julie takes us on her journey through grief and shares how she has built a life after loss.
We fight against the hard things in life, but the reality is these things have been in existence since the beginning of time. That we will all go through difficulty, we will all struggle, we will all, maybe we lose someone we love, or maybe we go through a painful divorce, or maybe we lose a job we love. Whatever it is, we all go through difficulty, and it's just the way of the world. And so I just stopped arguing with it. With the work that I do now and the understanding that I have, I've learned the things that work and the things that don't work, and what doesn't work is resisting the emotions that we feel. And so it was just a lot of tears, a lot of heartache, I was really patient with myself at first. I just realized that this is how it is, that grief is what it is, and I just had to be patient. But when my patience wore out is when I really started to dive into a deeper hole. And when I decided one day, I don't know, 1.5 years, like I should be doing better, and I started beating myself up because I wasn't doing better, that's when I really spiraled down. And I spiraled for quite a few months before I realized, and again, working with my therapist and holding on to the faith that I did have and continuing to make efforts. But that impatience that I had in my grief really did not serve me well. So for me, my children will always be my children, forever and ever and ever, whether they're here with me physically or not, they're always my children. I've built my love and my gratitude to have been their mother on this earth for 8 and 10 years. And that is where that's where I put my focus. I used to look for proof. I used to look for somebody to say to me, yes, this was meant to happen. And then I just decided one day, somebody else doesn't have to agree with me. I get to decide. I get to decide how I want to think about it and how I want to feel about it. And I truly do believe that I wasn't even tired that day. And for me to fall asleep at the wheel was just a freak accident. I believe we have to go through the grief, and we can build our gratitude along the way and our love, and we can create this bridge of love and gratitude to those that we've lost, instead of holding on to the pain in order to hold on to the person.
Thanks to Julie for sharing her story with us. After the break, we look at one organization striving to provide a safe and caring environment for grieving children and their families. Mountain Wellness will continue in a moment.
What is it about this place? What is it that has led to such a vibrant community of thinkers and doers? What is it that inspires a few young doctors to imagine the world's first artificial heart, or a few computer pioneers to create one of the 4 original nodes of the internet, or lifts an unlikely researcher to imagine a Nobel-worthy genetic code, and a young entrepreneur to imagine Adobe, and another Pixar Studios? This remarkable place has always fueled the life-saving and the life-affirming. This is the story of University of Utah health plans. Imagine the very best care science has to offer and world-class researchers collaborating to make it that much better, proving that healthcare and health insurance can be more accessible, more affordable, and more responsive. Now imagine what an entire health system and globally recognized university can do for you.
The following program contains material that is not suitable for some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
You're watching Mountain Wellness. I'm your host, Christine Napier. On today's episode, we are taking an in-depth look at the struggle with grief. As raw and emotional as the journey can be, it can actually help process feelings. Next, we visit the Sharing Place, whose mission is to provide a safe and caring environment for grieving children and their families.
The Sharing Place started in about 1993 is when we started as an organization, and it was founded by our founder. Her name is Chris Citrus. So she had 2 young kids at home, and her husband tragically died, and she noticed her kids were not doing well academically, socially. She really didn't know what to do for her kids, to kind of help her kids deal with their grief. So she was watching 2020 one day, and she saw a special about the Dougie Center, which is the first and largest and probably most recognized grief support center in the country, but it's up in Portland, Oregon. So Chris found a local I think she's a child psychologist, her name's Nancy Reiser, and they literally got their butts in a car and drove up to Portland and kind of learned how to start a peer-to-peer grief support model here. And they came back here, and Chris explains it to me. They started with 4 kids, and she describes it as like in a closet. So they actually started with 4 kids, and now we have a large home, and we served over 518 kids last year. The need is huge in the community. I was 1 in 16 kids by the age of 18 will have a parent or a sibling who dies. So if you just do the math about that, and just in the Salt Lake County alone, we're talking about thousands of kids. About 80% of them is a mom or dad, but a lot of time it's a sibling, a grandparent, aunt, or uncle. It's really up to them to decide who is significant in their life. It's not for us to decide that. We pair them in similar age groups. So we have a littles group where the kids are ages between 3 to 5. We have a school age group, which is 1st grade through 5th grade, and inside of that school age we have a suicide specific group, and we also have a complicated grief group. Then we have a preschool, which is 6th through 8th, and then a teen group, which is 9th through 12th. So we're really serious about serving as many kids and families that can benefit from our services. So last year we started a program out at Taylorsville because we really want to make our program more accessible to some of our West Side families. We really want them to be able to access our services as well. Our groups are ran by our group coordinators. I mean, they are amazing individuals. They're so creative about things they do. But grief is processed differently depending on the age of the kids. So each group kind of does a different activity. For the younger kids, they really process grief through play and physical activity and art. So they do a lot of that stuff. And then our older kids do a lot of discussions and conversations. And I do also want to add, inside our groups, we're supported by about 6 to 8 volunteers in each group. And really their whole role is to be there to support our kids and listen to our kids. But they are so valuable to what we do here at the Sharing Place. Well, our house is divided into half. So one part of our house is our school age and littles, and as you alluded, we have a volcano room. Everybody loves a volcano room. So it's really just a big padded room where the kids can release their anger, and anger is a huge part of the grief process, and we want them to learn the appropriate coping skills about how to release that anger. So we give them that opportunity. And our older kids have just to do a lot of conversation, and we have a fire pit in the backyard where they kind of sit around and talk, and it's really amazing how these kids can build these connections with one another. Kids who are going through grief, unresolved grief, they're more likely to abuse substances, drop out of school, increases suicide. So it's really important for these kids to realize that they're not alone. There's other kids and families that are going through the same situations, and we're here to let them talk about their stories and talk about their person and heal with their grief. Every group starts with, they gotta state their name, they gotta state the name of their person who's died and how they died. It's really important for the kids to talk about how they died. Sometimes it takes kids a little while to get there, but I think that's why they're here, to kind of help them process their grief, is kind of understanding how their person died. And then they'll do kind of a opening question. It could be, depending on the age of the kid, it could be simple as, what is your person's colored hair? What is your favorite memory of your person? And then the older teens and the adults will talk more about kind of what your highs and lows of the particular day of grief and how they can support one another. When our kids are getting their grief support, we also do a support group for the parent or the caregiver as well, and I think that's very important. We kind of hitting both sides of the family. Parents are really important in the grief process. If they're not able to deal with their grief, it's harder for them to raise and help process their children's grief. So one story I love to share that really illustrates kind of the peer-to-peer model is, I had one dad tell me the story one day is his wife died, and he goes, "John, I remember the first day I came to group, and I sat across this gentleman who's been at the sharing place for over 2 years, and I could see that he was smiling, he was laughing, he was acting quote unquote normal again." And he goes, "I wasn't there. I was in the darkest, deepest part of my life. I was depressed, I was sad, and just looking across that room, I got to see he was a role model for him." He goes, "I can get there one day. I can get to that point in my life again." It's kind of helped him get hope. And on the flip side, he's been here 2 years now. Now he's that person on the other side of the room where a new family's looking at him, and he's a role model for them about hope and learning how to live with grief. And I think it's a perfect illustration of kind of our program. Since I've worked here, it's really changed my beliefs in a lot of ways. It's really still, it's been 20 years since my father's death, but I'm still processing. Grief is a lifetime process, and I still process that every day. But it's really, some people ask me, it must be hard to work at a place where you're dealing with death and grief all the time. And yes, at times it is, but it's really helped change my outlook on life. Is every day and every moment's precious. You don't really know what may happen or what may not happen, so you gotta treat your loved ones, your family, and your friends. I mean, every day is precious, and never forget that. That's one of the big lessons I really learned here by working at the Sharing Place. Learn to talk about your loved ones. Be comfortable sharing your stories with people. I think it's really important to, not only does it kind of, it's a lasting memory that you have and you can just share your people, it makes you feel good, right? And I think grief is an important thing that people need to take serious. And if you're struggling with grief, I would say it's okay to cry, especially as a man. It's okay to cry and discuss and talk about your grief. It's really important because it's the only way you're gonna heal and move forward with your life and your grief, is to be able to have those discussions with people that you love. And don't forget, support. The Sharing Place is a non-for-profit too, and we really would love support from the community. We have big fundraisers every year. We need volunteers, so your support is very essential. You can go on our website at thesharingplace.org or give us a call at 801-466-6730.
Thank you to the Sharing Place for describing the amazing work that they do. When we come back, we learn about support groups available to help process complicated grief. Stay with us.
What is it about this place? What is it that has led to such a vibrant community of thinkers and doers? What is it that inspires a few young doctors to imagine the world's first artificial heart? Or a few computer pioneers to create one of the 4 original nodes of the internet? Or lifts an unlikely researcher to imagine a Nobel-worthy genetic code? And a young entrepreneur to imagine Adobe? And another Pixar Studios? This remarkable place has always fueled the life-saving and the life-affirming. This is the story of University of Utah health plans. Imagine the very best care science has to offer, and world-class researchers collaborating to make it that much better, proving that healthcare and health insurance can be more accessible, more affordable, and more responsive. Now imagine what an entire health system and globally recognized university can do for you.
The following program contains material that is not suitable for some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to Mountain Wellness. On today's show, we are examining the process of grief. How do you process grief and deal with the passage of loss? Sometimes it is helpful to be surrounded by those who are experiencing a similar circumstance. Next, we learn about support groups that are available through the University of Utah.
Our mission is primarily to care for grieving individuals who've lost someone, a variety of losses, through our grief group support program. So we offer 8-week grief support groups, and we divide our groups by the type of loss. They are facilitated by clinicians. So these are social workers, psychologists, chaplains, psychiatric nurse practitioners who volunteer their time and are trained by us and facilitate these 8-week groups. So we have groups going in cycles all throughout the year. And as of early April, all of our groups right now, of course, are virtual groups, which has extended our reach. We can take people from all over the state, and we have people from other states that are now participating in our grief support groups because we're doing them through Zoom. And our facilitators have adapted to that very quickly, and all our materials are electronic, so that went really well. Grief is normal, and it's healthy, and it's part of life. And amazingly, the human spirit and mind, and actually the body, are prepared to grieve. If you think about it, we come into the world, we have people that we come to, our parents, we have people who go before us, and our children after us. So we don't come into the world and die with our whole herd. So naturally, we have to have a mechanism to prepare us to lose people that we're deeply connected to and attached to and that we love. And so that's the normal process of grief. And most people do that well if they've got a few resources. They need some coping skills. They need other people who support them without judgment, family, friends, our groups, their religious communities, their neighbors and friends, if those people are understanding and patient, and then they need time. And grief should actually be disruptive. I mean, death should be disruptive. But when you lose someone with a big connection, it's a very deep grief, it takes a long time, and interestingly, you feel like you're going crazy. So you can't sleep, you're not hungry, or you overeat. People who are grieving in the acute stage of grief, the very early start of grief, they have very difficult time concentrating. They don't very often remember. That shock, that initial shock, can linger for a few weeks actually. And people do feel like they're going crazy, but they're not going crazy. But they feel that unsettledness. And that unsettledness is there to help you re-examine that relationship and how you're going to go forward in your own life, what that person meant to you, how you will remember that person. Just complicated grief, and that's the form of grief that's actually disabling for people, that just basically grinds their life to a halt. Different types of death predispose people to a more traumatic, complicated experience. Certainly suicide, certainly overdose death, and certainly now COVID death. Since the pandemic began in March, or when we were aware of the pandemic, the number of people who have lost a family member who's died in a hospital or in a nursing home, and that family member has not been able to be present at the time of death, people start that grief journey pretty traumatized. And then much of what is offered in funeral home care and meticulous funeral care is just not available. Very small funerals, and now we rob them, understandably, and we have to, but we rob them of the natural mechanisms. So again, remember I said people know how to grieve, so we see these drive-by funerals, and we're just seeing remarkable creative responses to this, but we don't really know what the long-term consequences. It's really important for all of us to be more attentive to each other's needs right now. You know, we always tell people the hard days of grief are after the casseroles stop coming and all the flowers are wilted, but the people who love you the most and would understand you the most would be able to look for those visible signs and say, you know, time for another card. That first card wasn't enough. But now we're not in proximity, and We have to be much more intentional, looking out for each other's emotional well-being. If that's a Zoom drop-in or that's leaving a loving package on the front steps and say, hey, wasn't it 2 weeks ago today that, you know, your dad died? Just want you to know I'm thinking of you. Those things carry a lot of power. And, well, of course, because love always does. And those compassionate approaches and those compassionate gestures really are profoundly meaningful in normal times. But boy, now we all need to look for those opportunities in our provision of grief support. So I think we want to appreciate, and what I appreciate is the smaller gestures that nurses do at the bedside, the kindness that the social worker and the hospice agency offers, the thoughtful attention that the emergency room doctor gives to the family after the patient has died of a cardiac arrest, the police officer on the scene of a motor vehicle accident who responds with compassion and courtesy, the firefighter, the same thing, the neighbor, the church community. All of those things are basically aligning the rudder to go in the right direction, to help people get their natural normative grief processes going. And it can be difficult. That said, I will say that for people who struggle with depression or anxiety and then struggle with grief, grief gives them this challenging but wonderful opportunity to examine their own coping skills and grow their own resiliency and learn new ways of reaching out to other people and taking support in other places and gaining confidence of themselves. Grief can be very depressing, it can be very distressing in the early days, and we just want to be able to let you know that we're here to support you. So reach out to us at Caring Connections. We are here to comfort you in your grief and are eager to offer our support. Thank you.
I want to thank all of our guests for sharing their stories today. Remember, grief is a journey, not a momentary condition. Continue to have those difficult conversations. You never know when they'll make a difference. I'm Christine Napier. See you next time.